Sri Lanka in the 1960s. It was essentially where people just came for a room with a view, and then perhaps have some nice food, chill out on the beach, and go back to their homes. Today, people travel for different reasons. They travel first for business, but they also travel when they travel on holiday. They want a little bit more than a room. They want experiences. And it's called experiential travel. Everybody goes to do that. Now, the whole point of experiential travel is that you travel to places and you go and look at places that have a story to tell you. It's not just a hotel room, it's not just accommodation, it's accommodation with a story, it's an environment with a story. And as I brought up this morning, it's important to have some of those things clearly embodied in our vision for Sri Lanka's tourism for the future. And that's where heritage comes in as a very, very important part of it. The Jaffna Peninsula in particular is full of buildings and heritage structures that are essentially full of stories, full of ideas that you could use to, one, attract people, and then of course make them interact with those. I have been looking at some of the places in Jaffna, and there are still hundreds of old houses that are dilapidated, falling apart. And it is really the buildings that make up a place. If you go to Venice, it's the buildings of Venice that make up Venice. You go to see those buildings. The atmosphere of Paris is the buildings of Paris. If you go to Jodhpur, if you go to Lhasa, any of those towns, it's really about the buildings that have been conserved and looked after. And that's where heritage conservation comes in tourism, to create an identity for a place that is unique to its place. Even if you think about the Jaffna Peninsula as opposed to, say, Kandy, the kind of architecture that you have in these two places, although they're very closely related, because we are very closely culturally related, they are also very different. The houses that you have in Jaffna are also courtyard houses, as are courtyard houses in Kandy, but the type of courtyard house and the detail that you have on Jaffna house is that much more different. And therefore it is well worth preserving a lot of these things as part of conservation effort to carry out and bring out the identity of Jaffna. So the idea of taking old buildings and creating identity for tourism, of course, comes in the middle of the 20th century. And some of the earliest sort of actions were to bring some of the old palace hotels in India, and you see how famous they are now. And you have places like the Rambat Palace, the Jodhpur Palace. All of them have become identities for those places, and people go to those cities to see them, sometimes not even stay in them, but to engage with them. But we have a different story in Sri Lanka, where we have our heritage conservation hotels are much smaller scale, and they don't begin until the late 1980s or the 90s, when in mid-1995, Geoffrey Bawa, Sri Lanka's most famous architect, took an old house on the beach near Bentota and converted it into a very small 15-room hotel. And that perhaps could be considered one of the first boutique hotels that happened in Sri Lanka and heritage conservation projects. Similarly, I had the privilege of restoring a whole lot of lovely old buildings near Galle, Durenberg, which traded under the name the Dutch House for about 20 years before it was sold out, and still continues as Durenberg. But the Dutch House became a sort of watchword for the kind of heritage tourism that you could get in this country. The Galle Fort then opened out when things were easy for foreigners to buy, and you find a lot of them buying these lovely old houses, converting them by keeping a conservation approach to those conversions. They managed to attract people into Galle. And we know what Galle is today. It's a thriving, like absolutely busy place. And I can quite imagine Jaffna becoming a place like that, where a lot of the old houses get conserved as accommodation, and then you see something that goes along. If you don't have an identity, then it's still important that we actually invent an identity for ourselves. And if you think about Sri Lanka's early efforts at tourism in the 1960s, some of the earliest hotels that were built particularly by Bawa. And one of the examples I can give you is the Bentota Beach Hotel. For the first time, you had a large tourist building that managed to use local materials and use local identity onto those buildings to attract people who wanted to come and stay in those places. In fact, his work on the Bentota Beach went on to influence a whole lot of other buildings right across South and Southeast Asia to create almost a style of architecture for tourism that was to do with identity. And that is why you still have hundreds of people going to see the Aman resorts of this world and all of these places, because they give identity to those places and you get unique experiences when you get there. Now the thing about heritage conservation as part of tourism is that some of the conservation projects are really quite small. And having small conservation projects in many parts of the community means that a lot of money goes more directly into the community as well. So for me, the impact of heritage and conservation in tourism is that its wealth and its generation of wealth goes more directly and more closely into the communities in which these tourism organizations happen. And for that, I think conservation and heritage tourism is an important aspect looking forward in the tourism story in this part of the country. So if we had to talk about tourism in heritage and the importance of heritage and conservation and the impact it has, it's really about creating and holding on to the identity that Jaffna already has, which is myriad stories to be told. And of course, it helps in the conservation of our old buildings. And of course, the impact it has on communities is much stronger and much more closely felt than if you have a very large company coming along and putting up a hotel of 100 rooms in some corner. That's needed as well, but I think we already have much in Jaffna. And if I am to go by a map of the old houses that I was shown over lunch today, I think we can have a 600-room hotel in Jaffna if you wanted to, with all of the old, beautiful old houses that are there. A lot of them dilapidated, a lot of them falling apart, but there is hope for that. And I think that's just the message that I'd like to leave with you at this technical session. Thank you very much. Sorry I couldn't show you the slides. I think there's a technical mishap there. But maybe next time, or maybe the organizers can share it with you at some other future date. Thank you very much.